Hello, thank you for tuning in to another podcast hosted by the Global America Business Institute. My name is Brian Chung, and I am the Director of Programs and Strategy here at GABI. For today's podcast, I have with me Paul Murphy, who is the founder and managing director of Murphy Energy and Infrastructure Consulting and the co-head of public finance and government relations at Cross River Infrastructure Partners. Today, we'll be discussing nuclear financing. Hi, Paul, how are you?
I'm doing great, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So, I kind of wanted to start off with a broad overarching question. And with many countries facing high electricity prices and fuel scarcity, how does that impact how we currently think of nuclear power in the context of financing?
Well, I think it starts with just how we think of nuclear energy in the world today. I think there was already a driving force behind nuclear in the context of climate change and nuclear having a key role to play as we go forward. And when you look at the benefits of nuclear, there's some intangibles, whether it's energy diversity or climate change. And one of the things on that list was always energy security. But I don't think people quite thought of it the way that we're looking at it over the last year after, the war in Ukraine, February of 2022. And so I think when you start to recognize the importance of energy security, you realize that there's a certain fundamental place for electricity in our society today. I think there's this assumption in modern society that when you flip the wall switch, the lights are supposed to go on. When you turn the spigot, clean water is supposed to come out. And it's just the way it is. And of course, excuse me, we recognize that in a lot of parts of the world, that isn't the case, but we've seen how energy has become weaponized by certain malign actors. We see that when electricity prices get really high, it has profound economic consequences for the people. We're seeing Western Europe, but frankly, in Asia as well, where you saw LNG tankers that were on their way to Asia being turned around to go to Europe to capture higher prices, such that they were willing to pay the penalties for breaking contracts for their deliveries to Asia. So, not only did the situation in Europe impact Europe, but it's also impacting other parts of the world as we go forward. So, as we think about the need for electricity, we start to get into the idea that electricity is critical infrastructure. And when you think about it in those ways, and when you think about the need for energy policy in the context of critical infrastructure, it's something that you just have to have. And so it starts to focus more on project deliverability than perhaps cost. And the idea that these plants just have to get built in a reasonable time frame for energy security, also to meet our climate change objectives, our decarbonization objectives. But with a critical infrastructure mindset, that starts to bring in the role of government policy to provide the mechanisms necessary to get these things built once we determine that we absolutely need them. And that's where you start to see things like, the contract for difference in the UK, or now the regulated asset-based model. You see some of the programs in the United States and Canada, whether it's with regard to taxes or loans or things that are trying to drive these projects forward, where maybe the market isn't quite ready to go. And then that starts to open up an interesting conversation about, well, when should we use government support? When does it stop? When can the market take over? But I think that is where we really see this all hitting home. And we also see, frankly, the failure of some of our policies before. And it's not to make this about bashing renewables by any means. Renewables have their place, but
Right,
there was this sort of feeling some years ago, well, we don't need baseload generation. We can have 100% renewables. And what we've seen is that a lot of those assumptions that would have been debatable 4 years, 5 years, 10 years ago, we see what the numbers look like in Europe right now. And the numbers, the math, we could have pointed that out years ago, and some of us did, but it didn't prove out yet. And now it's proven out. And I think that we have to learn from that and design our policies a little bit differently.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then you talked about a couple of very, I guess, important aspects related to the current nuclear area, which is climate change and energy security, as well as how critical infrastructure is kind of playing into this. So, are you seeing any trends coming out of the nuclear finance space lately? Where do you see these three intersecting as we move to kind of tackle the challenges that we're seeing currently?
Well, I think you're seeing is, especially as we move to newer technologies, SMRs, advanced reactors, the need for government support to get these first reactors built. So we're seeing
Hmm.
programs in the United States and Canada and the United Kingdom. We expect that will hopefully drive these projects forward and try to shoulder some of that first of a kind risk that maybe some of these companies are not in a position to take, maybe the market is not in a position to take. And
Hmm.
so I think that driver from the government side is very important, because we're seeing a lot of innovation happening in the nuclear sector. When you think about SMRs or advanced reactors or micro reactors or even fusion, we see that things are being driven forward to a point, but then it needs to be helped along. And I think that's where we're seeing government financing mechanisms coming into play, whether it's grants or cost sharing, loans, tax credits. All these things are really helpful. um, but I think that we always have to remember too that we deregulated electricity markets in many places, and there's a lesson to be learned there, because every single nuclear plant that was built in the United States was at the time it was built in a regulated market. And then we wonder why we can't build in deregulated markets. And I think we're seeing the challenges of electricity markets, especially when, in the United States, we're enjoying very cheap natural gas for a long time. You have support for renewables in terms of subsidies and dispatch preferences, all of which these are policy decisions, but you still need a diverse energy mix. You still need base load. So how are we going to make that happen? So I think that's the first push where government policy is coming into place to help keep, move that along, move that along. But, we're also seeing that private capital is being mobilized, which is exciting. We're seeing that nuclear is getting ESG treatment, and so being considered clean, green, whatever term you want to use. But we've seen major movement in Europe on this issue. We've seen movement in the United States and Canada as well. And that's quite significant as we think of how we might finance these projects.
I see. So you mentioned a lot of different issues, including the deregulated markets, the regulated markets, and how the government is attempting to kind of bridge the spaces together to help nuclear. But do you think that we're approaching this from the right angle, or do you think there are kind of other ways we can support the nuclear industry?
Well, I think we have to be careful, because when you think about the focus now, there's this view that perhaps that it's all about demonstrating the first reactor, getting that first one built. And then after that, the market will take over and get comfortable with it. But, we think about first of a kind risk, we tend to think about technology, but you have to also think about it in terms of going into newcomer countries, dealing with a regulator who's never maybe regulated this particular technology before. And so the point at which the market can fully take over during development and construction is the challenge. And I think we have to be careful there not to sort of move away from that too quickly because, with large reactors, that period of time is very, very long. We hope that with SMRs, it's going to be shorter. But, passive investors don't want to be putting money into a project for that long, and not getting a return and being, exposed to regulatory and other risks. And so I think, yes, we think about getting that first one done. Yes, we hope that we move to on time and on budget so that we don't have these situations where plants were promised and then, it's a decade later or better. The case of Olkiluoto 3 in Finland, where it was supposed to be 2009 and now it's the end of 2022 and it's still not fully operational. So those are the things we have to avoid as we go forward, because that, the more that we can deliver, the more that we can start attracting more money into the sector. But it really gets down to, I think, de-risking these projects. And at the end of the day, investors will want to see a long-term steady return on the asset. And if they see that, and if it's credit worthy, that's investable. And then you start getting into the question of the timing of that investment. I think you might start to see investors come in at commercial operation or after a year or two of operation. But if we can get them there, then you start to say, well, can we move that a little earlier? Move that a little earlier? What might it take? And I think once we prove the technology works, I don't think people really worry so much about will it eventually work. It's more that how much is it going to cost and how long is it going to take to get there. But once we demonstrate that, then you're already starting to de-risk this a little bit more. And how we can help that along and also streamline the regulatory process, which is can be a confidence building better measure, but frankly it's a great source of uncertainty. That's, I think, where there's an opportunity as well.
I see. You kind of touched some on this from the financing considerations for moving from large reactors to SMRs, smaller reactors. And right now, given the environment of some significant federal support for the demonstrations, how are you seeing the financing considerations move from large reactors to small modular reactors? Are we in the right direction, or is there something else that we should be considering?
Well, I think there's a lot of excitement in the sense that we're seeing investors make investments in the technology, which is really important. We have to have it. So I'm not challenging the importance of that at all. But we need to start seeing is that investment going into the project. Because once you have the technology to a certain point, then you get into the project specifics and you say, okay, well, how am I going to pay for the project? How am I going to finance the project? We can develop technology all we want, but if we don't turn that into real projects, what good is it?
Mhm.
Yes, we may learn some things and there may be advancements, but if we think of nuclear more as a tool to solve problems, whether it's electricity and development or climate change or energy security, or even in the applications in terms of desalination and hydrogen production and all these things we get excited about, I think we have to start delivering projects. And deliverability is obviously in the execution, which is very important, but we need to put the actual money into these projects to make them go forward. So I think that's one of the biggest things as we move into this new technology space, is to see that it's great that the first part is being done, the technology is being, investment is occurring, but moving it into projects becomes the next thing. And that gets into the project fundamentals, project risks, the stability of the return, which we talked about before. That's why I think you're seeing, at least for large reactors and presumably for small reactors in the UK, they're moving from a contract for difference, which is focused on, guaranteeing a price if you produce, to now the regulated asset-based model, where you're getting in a deregulated market, you're kind of creating a regulated structure and getting, the returns coming sooner. So when you start construction, and very much like what we've done in the United States and some regulated markets with allowing project costs to be put in the rate base in regulated markets so that we can start recovering on those investments sooner. That, obviously changes your project model. Um, but frankly, the other thing the UK is looking at too is using more to finance the projects, because there's been a lot of work done on, how can we lower the cost of capital? Yes, we might be able to source it, but if it's really expensive, then that's detrimental to project development. So how can we lower the cost of capital? And that's where I think the UK government has said, well, if we use our own money and take bigger positions on these projects, well, you know, that will do it. Our money is cheaper than private investor money. And that is correct, but it's not something that can be done forever. So getting that help early on and then figuring out how to transition it so that private capital will come in is important. And I think that's where you really start to focus on refinancing, because if you look at the risks on a nuclear project, they're so heavily weighted toward development and construction. Yet
Mhm.
once it goes into operation, if we get the economics right in terms of that operating period, you can easily see investors coming in and taking over those initial government positions, getting that government money out to go do other things, whether it's other nuclear projects or other types of infrastructure investment, and having private capital take over at that point and come into the projects, because we need to mobilize so much capital to get so many of these projects built. Government finance can't do it all. So figuring out how we can most effectively use that government support to time it at the riskiest periods and then let private capital take over. um, I think that's where we have to focus. And then once we get that right, we can then start walking it back from there to see, well, it once I have a refinanced position, maybe even prepackaged while in construction, then I start to say, well, can I move it sooner? Can I move it sooner? As I mentioned before, and we can see if we can do better. But I think there's a lot of private capital out there that's looking for stuff to do. Especially now in this ESG space. You had Bruce Power in Canada and OPG thereafter both do green bond issuances that were certified by an independent agency that they were green for nuclear, and they were oversubscribed by a factor of 6. And I think that's really exciting when we start to see the investor appetite for this long-term asset that is green, as we push the financial community in terms of concerns about greenwashing. Are you really doing something good with your money? The fact that you see 2 bond issuances getting oversubscribed by 6x
Mhm.
shows that there is appetite for this. And now we've got to get the projects to that point. I think there's money sitting out there now that's waiting for projects. They're not waiting for technology. They're making those decisions, but they're waiting for projects. And that's, I think, where we have to go next.
How do we get to that point? How do we connect the projects with all this funding that's available?
You got to put together good projects. I mean, and I don't mean to be, flippant when I say that, but there's a view that somehow by getting nuclear to be recognized as ESG friendly or qualifying, that all of a sudden we're going to be financing all these projects. And the answer is not so fast, my friend, because
Mhm.
you still need a good project. Capital isn't going to go to a project that doesn't have those strong fundamentals just because now it's green. What it does is, if you have a good project, now you can tap resources that might otherwise not have been available to you. And maybe, as we talked about cost of capital before, if you compare green bonds generally to non-green bonds, they price out better. It's cheaper money because of the green quality to it that investors are seeking. There's greater demand. So, it's cheaper money for the bond issuer. So these are all good things. You still need a good project. You still need all those fundamentals in terms of the technology and the risk allocation, the contracts, the experienced parties, the deliverability. And I think that's where we start to have some difficulties because especially in the new technologies, because we don't have the track record yet. So until it's done, it hasn't been done. But the other thing is just knowledge in the financial community of nuclear that has to come along too. It's, they understand other types of infrastructure investment better than nuclear because we haven't been doing nuclear. And so, how do we get institutions to become more knowledgeable, to understand, yes, nuclear is complicated but manageable, as opposed to an attitude of, well, I'm not anti-nuclear, but I know this is complicated and I really don't want to invest the time to figure it out right now. There's other things I can do with my money. There's no divine right of nuclear financing. So, we have to work with the financial community, which is happening,
Mhm.
to make nuclear more accessible and try and figure out ways to build up that knowledge base with information. And I think that's already happening. It just has to continue at scale. But I think that's part of it is it's not so much an anti-nuclear sentiment, is it's a lack of familiarity because of the lack of project history. If you're doing the next combined cycle gas plant, well, we've done so many of those, or wind farm or solar. People know how that stuff works. They're familiar with the technology. It's fairly boilerplate. It's easy to do. So you just look at the economics of the project and off you go. With nuclear, there's this additional quality to it that people have to get comfortable with. And that can mean different things to different people, but that sort of reluctance we have to overcome, and we have to mobilize that capital, which again, I take a lot of comfort in seeing what happened with Bruce Power and OPG with those green bond instruments because it shows it can be done if it's done well, and obviously they did it well and how they approached it and informed the financial community. That's, I think, the way to go is doing that work up front to make sure that it's understood. And somebody might say, well, Paul, yes, but those were existing assets. True, but it shows that initial reluctance when you say the word nuclear is already being overcome. So if we've been able to do it for that, then all of the technologies that are coming, or the large reactors that we still need, we can overcome that if we develop projects and financial structures that are based on sound financing principles and sound project structures. We're never going to get around that. And people have to recognize that, if an SMR vendor says, well, I just want to be a vendor, you're like, well, that's great. Where's the rest of the project? And it's that project mentality of putting together all those pieces that's really important. That's why I got involved with Cross River, and what we're doing
Mhm.
right now in a project up in Canada. But it's that idea of having groups that can pull all the pieces together to present an attractive investment opportunity for potential investors.
I'm curious about how this affects a lot of these export considerations because one of the main attributes of SMRs is its exportability. So when we look to newcomer countries, you mentioned a lot of de-risking needs, and there are still going to be significant regulatory needs there. Well, what are the challenges and what are the main considerations that we're looking from financing for these exports?
Well, I mean, what starting before with some preliminaries, I think there's always the export control issues that have to be managed. There's, the bilateral agreements that have to be in place. But I think when you look at newcomer countries, there's a lot of interest in SMRs. I believe it's real. I believe SMRs and advanced reactors can make a lot of sense, especially when you're talking about countries that don't have as much money. So just in the aggregate, it's a cheaper asset than a large reactor. Um, but the problem is there's a lot of sloppy analysis because there's sort of this assumption. You say, well, here are the world's electricity needs, and if I get this percentage of the market, this is how much money I'll make. And the reality is, you say, but are these countries ready to be members of the nuclear community? Do they have a regulator? Have they built all the nuclear infrastructure at a programmatic level? Have they entered into the proper international treaties on safety, security, safeguards, nuclear liability, all these things to have a viable program and then a project within that program? Because a vendor may have something to sell, but if the country isn't ready and you don't have a knowledgeable owner and a proper regulator and all these things, the financial community is not going to support it, because when you do a reputational risk analysis, that creates levels of risk around the project that people don't want to be associated with. So bringing those countries to the table, not I want nuclear and here's my case for nuclear, but that's one and two, and then three is, and I'm ready for it. And I think that's where the vendor countries can help. I think that, in terms of the development stage, you look at Development Finance Corporation, United States, you look at US Trade Development Agency, they can provide some funding early on for feasibility studies and other work that needs to be done that can help these countries. The State Department has the first program in the United States too. So, I think the US, but also other exporting countries, can provide help to bring these countries along programmatically, to help with the training of people, the human resources development that's needed. All these things need to be done and they require money. And you think of that maybe in terms of funding as opposed to maybe financing at the project level. But that's hugely important, so that you have the two sides have to come together, not just, well, I have a reactor to sell you. And that's where we need to mobilize support and also help structure good projects in these countries so that they are financeable, at the project level. That's, I think, where a lot of work really needs to be done, because we want the developing world to, benefit. Just when you look at quality of life and electrification, there's a direct relationship. But as we electrify, we want it to be clean to help meet our decarbonization goals. So how we bring this all together is important. And once you do all that, then you finally get to the point where, okay, well, how am I going to finance that? And that starts to raise some interesting issues, because the geopolitics come into play, because the world is a very different place than it was maybe 5 years ago or so.
Right.
And some of this gets into countering Russia and China. We would like to believe that after Russia invaded Ukraine, that everybody would not want to deal with them anymore, but that has not been the case. You look at Finland has canceled their project. You look at Turkey and Egypt, and they have not. And there's complex reasons for all of this, but Russia is still out there, China is out there. There are geopolitical considerations, and that gets into the attractiveness of a financing package and what might need to be done to compete with the attractiveness of what's being offered from our competitors. And I think that also gets into how can maybe we come together as OECD countries when we start thinking about global supply chains. The idea of one country doing everything at all levels of the deal may not be appropriate in all cases. It might not be practical in a lot of cases. And so, how, if we need a global supply chain to support these projects, that is something that we need to look at, because then we can source financing, export credit finance, from a variety of sources. You look at, going back to some of the things we've talked about during this discussion, you look at the technology investment that's coming into the SMR developers in the United States, and it's coming from places like Korea and Japan. And that gets really exciting because you see how these partnerships are being created through technology investment that then can translate into structuring financing for the project, principally with export credit finance to help these projects go forward and do it in a way that is attractive and competitive relative to the competition. But in order to get there, we've got to provide the earlier stage support, which is needed as well, which also requires money. And that's not going to come from private capital. That's going to have to be more from government levels of support to help these countries along.
How do we leverage that government support as effectively as we can? There is a lot of interest now, and there's a lot of government, I guess, especially in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act. You've seen a lot of support for developing supply chains, but what else can we do to, I guess, help build up the capacity and the infrastructure we need to support this big influx of the demand for nuclear?
Well, I think you hit on one of the ones that is important is, building up the supply chain, building the fabrication. So when, the SMR vendors say, well, we're going to achieve these efficiencies by having, factory construction or modular construction, and you got to build a factory. And then it becomes a chicken and the egg of, well, do I build a new factory if I don't have the order book to support it yet? And so I think that's where governments can come in to help provide, attractive financing to do this. Just in the United States, Exim can actually provide financing for factories that are dedicated for exports. Those are the kinds of things I think in the supply chain we definitely need to focus on. And, especially in the early days, maybe figuring out, as I mentioned before, with some of our friends and partners, how can we do this together to, provide best in class as part of delivery is, who does this best? Let's make sure they're doing it first, and then we can scale from there. But I think human resources development is also critical at all levels. So that gets into university programs and exchanges and, training and all of those types of things. Then you get into the early stage, helping to finance the studies, all the early work that needs to be done. I think when you look at some of the biggest challenges we face, it's getting to financial close or getting to the final investment decision. There's a lot of money that needs to be spent on these projects before you get to that point. And it's a big question sometimes of where that's going to come from. So, could it come from, a government grant, a loan? Can you have certain investors come in if they can see, other investors take them out later? I think these are all the things we need to explore, because that early stage finance that needs to occur for the projects is one of the most difficult things, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And the grand scale of a project, it isn't that expensive, but at that stage, it's really expensive when there's no sign of revenues coming into the project pre-FID or pre-financial close. That's, I think, where we need to target. Again, how do we get money into these projects at earlier stages? I think that's an opportunity for government support where we're saying, what is the most challenging time in a project cycle for investors? And it's that early stage. So if that's a problem, then can we target certain support packages there so that we can get through that relatively short amount of time, but high risk time, to then bridge that gap to when, private money can start to take over, where, commercial lenders can step in as well. I think that's going to be the key, I think, to getting a lot of these projects going forward.
How do you see the reception of that idea? Is that something that we can see traction on from other countries, from the US? What is the prospect of this catching on?
Well, I think we're already seeing it with, in the US with how NuScale has been supported by the Department of Energy, and now the TerraPower Natrium project and the X Energy project under the ARDP, they're being supported. I mean, I think it's those kinds of things. I go back to what I said before. The danger is thinking, well, once we do this the first time, then it solves all problems for all time. And I don't think that's going to be the answer. I think there's still going to be on individual projects. How do we get to all that early work done? I think when you look at what OPG is doing at Darlington with GE Hitachi, that's a big provincial regulated utility that can do long-term planning. So with big regulated utilities, or TVA in the United States, again with GE Hitachi, I think you can see situations where that type of a player can start to overcome these risks. But once you get out of that space, it does become an open question. And so I think that's where there is concern at the project level. But I think that providing cheap capital from government sources that can be repaid over long tenors, that can be, I think, an attractive thing. And I think we're seeing some new thinking in Canada, and probably with when Great British Nuclear is launched early in 2023, that you may see some new thinking on government support to drive these projects forward. So I think those are two things to really look at. Some of the things that have been announced in Canada just within the last week, and watching GBN in the UK, I think there's going to be some good insights coming from how they choose to proceed, because it really does get to, we have a challenging piece of the puzzle early on in these projects, and somebody's going to need to carry that. And if we don't have the equivalent of an OPG or a TVA, how do we get these projects built? And that comes all the way back to this very fundamental point of, do we want nuclear? And if we do, because of some of the things we talked about earlier, under this critical infrastructure mentality of decarbonization and energy security, that's where governments have the power to act once they believe that this is the tool that's needed to solve certain problems. It's not about, oh, wouldn't this be nice? Or, we have lots of different choices. It's getting very specific about why we need nuclear. And once you get to that point, then you put the policies in place. I think sometimes we tend to overcomplicate this stuff. And I think the art in all this is to take what is a very complicated endeavor and simplify it. And, as say in the United States, and the sports analogies with football, it's blocking and tackling. The basics are there as to what private capital will look for, what banks want to see in a project. And the question is, do we want to create that structure to then mobilize the capital? And we only want to do that if we're convinced of the need for it. And I think over the last year or two, we've really seen that attitudes have changed in a positive way for nuclear. And I think that makes it easier to put the policies in place to drive things forward.
I see. Well, that does seem quite positive for the way it's going. I just wanted to ask if you had any closing thoughts before we ended this podcast. If any broad, overarching last ideas, last thoughts.
I think, financing is always the great test for projects. You can have the best case for why you want a certain type of project, and you can mobilize all the support around it. But if it's not financeable, there is no project, even if you have good technology. And so I think that project fundamentals are critical. And talk about financing. I've had situations where people have asked me to give a financing presentation, and two criticisms. They say, well, oh, don't talk about risk or don't talk about economics, just talk about financing. And you sort of scratch your head and you say, that's pretty much impossible, because you have to deal with project risks and show how they've been identified, allocated, priced into the deal. And then the economics have to be sound, because if we want to attract that money, it's only going to come into a project if it has sound fundamentals. And if there's a better project out there in terms of returns and reduced risk, that's where the money is going to go, not to nuclear. And so this project mentality, I think, is so critical to driving things forward. And we want to encourage new technologies. We want to see SMRs and advanced reactors succeed for all the things that they can do. But getting over that first of a kind challenge, that's, I think, one of the key places where government can come in. And so I think this idea of the need for government support in all forms, it can be different in different cases, but really being precise in what we need, when we need it, and then how, by providing that support, it unlocks the project and unlocks at some point in the project cycle that non-government finance, I think, is where we need to drive things forward. Because at the end of the day, I just obsess with this critical infrastructure piece that we need to decarbonize, we need to have energy security. Electricity is fundamental to modern society, so we need it, and we need it to be there all the time. We need it to be there when the wind's blowing isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. We need it to do things like desalination and these all these applications-based things like hydrogen, where if we want to move to a hydrogen economy, we need to produce a lot of it, not a little of it. And driving these projects forward, I think nuclear has a key place to play. And if we're convinced of that, we need to do a lot of these projects, especially over the coming decade in the 2030 to 2040 time period. And that's going to require a lot of money. So we can't just rely on government sources. I think that's a temporary fix. It's a really important catalyst for these projects. But if we get it right, and that's a combination of governments and the regulators and the owners and operators and the supply chain and the vendors and the constructors, we need all these pieces to come together. And we need to scale an industry that hasn't scaled in a long time. And I think we can not be overly pessimistic, because we see, what the US was able to build at scale at one time. We see what France was able to do at one time. We were able to build a lot of these once we got it right. We see how Korea, for example, through doing the same thing over and over again, achieve certain levels of efficiency. That's what we want to get to. I think we have to get there faster. And so we have to look for ways to make it easier without compromising safety, security, and safeguards. But sometimes we overcomplicate these projects, and then we overcomplicate the financing solution. Keeping it simple is I think where the art is, and that's where the expertise has to come in to build tried and tested approaches, and that's going to unlock the capital. And again, we have over 400 plants operating in the world today. It's not impossible. And now with I think with this enthusiasm for nuclear as an ESG friendly type of investment, with the evidence of things that have happened with Bruce and OPG and other things that we're seeing in the space, there's reason for excitement. And I think the next two things that we really need to see is that move from technology investment to project investment, and then specifically dealing with that early stage of the project cycle that's challenging, because I truly do believe that we can refinance this money once we get these projects underway. And that'll be the first step in, I think, getting to tap these sources of capital that are waiting for good projects to be put before them. I think that's where there's a lot of reason for excitement, and I think it's a necessity. And so, with that necessity mentality, we're encouraged to find solutions.
I think that's a great point. I mean, especially with all this global support for nuclear and the strong real demand that we're seeing that you mentioned from these emerging markets, I think it really does become such an important point to be able to deliver these projects and really connect these projects with the financing that's available. Thank you so much for being with us, Paul. And thank you to all of our audience members who tuned in for this podcast. We look forward to the next GABI podcast. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.